So in paragraph 76, Dr. Jung is talking about psychic energy, which he says is libido. Now, libido for Freud was the sex drive. But for Dr. Jung, when he talked about libido, he was talking about psychic energy. And so remember in physics, E equals mc squared, and the fact that there is conservation of energy. And so we have psychic energy too. We supply it by various means, and it bounces around. It's conserved, but it also comes in through our food and through our water and so on. But it also bounces around, and if it gets repressed, it's going to get repressed down into the unconscious, where it's not going to go away. He says, psychic energy is a very fastidious thing which insists on fulfillment of its own conditions. We cannot make it serviceable until we have succeeded in finding the right gradient. Now, by gradient, I think if you had an image of a rut in a dirt road after a rainstorm, you might think of that as a gradient. But obviously what he's talking about is pathways of synaptic firings through a series of neurons. When I say a certain word, whatever it is, that word will immediately fire neurons in your mind, and that will bring up an image. Now, every word is seen differently in our imagery, and so I can't predict what it will be. But if I say the word Mercedes-Benz, now everybody that's listening to this has had synaptic firings going back through their neurons, but everybody's image of a Mercedes-Benz is different. And if I say Volkswagen Bug, again, it's different. Is yours yellow, or is it blue, or is it red, or is it black or white, or what color? Is it a 1953 Bug that had the two small back windows and the stripe down the middle, or is it a more modern Bug like the ones that have come out recently? All those things are psychic gradients. What Dr. Jung is talking about here is gradients that have existed for a long time. They're also the archetypes, obviously. So, for example, the mother archetype, obviously when certain things happen in your life, you become pregnant and certain things happen in the psyche, which have happened to all mothers since time immemorial, and they all work in the same way. And so those are the archetypes. So the same with warrior. If the United States were attacked tonight, we'd have all American men working together. There wouldn't be any issue of blue state or red state. And in fact, in the American military, political activity is not allowed. But the warrior archetype would be engendered. The same is true of the lover archetype, or the king archetype, or the high priestess. All those archetypes have certain gradients that are all within all of us, and if certain things happen, they are going to, they're going to fire off and do things. So in paragraph 77, then even the most strenuous exertions in analysis would not have sufficed had there not been present at the same time a gradient in that direction. So in other words, an analyst in a psychotherapy can't just convince somebody. It's not a matter of logic. They have to understand what the gradients likely are in the psyche, namely the archetypes, and then they have to see a way clear to bring one's mind into that gradient. So paragraph 78 then, life can flow forward only along the path of the gradient, but there is no energy unless there is a tension of opposites. So we have to have a tension of opposites. It either has to draw us together or pull us apart, but it's because of those opposites that we have energy at all. And it's a process. So Dr. Jung used to use the example of the waterfall, where the water comes over the waterfall, and obviously that has potential energy in it, and which can be captured. And then when the water gets down to the sea, then it re-evaporates up and goes back to the top of the waterfall and comes down again, and that's a continuing process. And that process creates energy and gives us the water we need. Thomas says, I've been thinking about how Buddha posits the non-existence of the self, or self. Anatta is the phrase which would seem to make it problematic for Jungian. The way it's been described by Dr. Edinger that I know of is that the Buddha was on the self end of the spectrum, and Christ was on the ego end. And so in Buddhist meditation, we actually are trying to just go communicate directly with the self. That's what meditation does. Buddhism is a very complicated philosophy, but it all comes down to, it is about self, but it's about self in the pleroma, basically. So it's about big picture self, which Edinger talked about. I think what you're thinking of, maybe, Thomas, is the non-existence of ego. That ego, one is trying to leave behind the ego in Buddhism, and obviously that works to a degree. My criticism of Buddhism is that it tends to make very passive people, and very quiet, passive people, which is maybe okay when you only have $1 a day for everybody to live on. It's a question about whether you can survive that way. And so there has to be a middle ground between self and ego. And then Thomas is separating out personal unconscious dream contents, symbols from collective unconscious contents. Symbols is such a challenging yet rewarding endeavor, useful for fiction writing also, absolutely. And if you're fiction writing, I urge you to stick with the archetypes, and they're in the collective unconscious and they resonate with everyone. That doesn't mean that you don't have personal experience of the archetypes that you can bring into your writing. Start with the stories of the famous myths, basically, and then build another world around those myths, because those myths have the archetypes in them. We have to have this tension of opposites, because if we don't, nothing happens. One of the reasons that lots of stuff happens in the United States is that we work everything out, maybe painfully, but it's the process that has worked for us. And so hence it's necessary to discover the opposite to the attitude of the conscious mind. So whatever your conscious mind thinks about whatever it is, try to discover in your own unconscious what the opposite of that is, because therein is a flow of energy, and if you can harness that, then you've found the transcendent function, and that makes you very strong. But that's a very hard thing to do without getting in serious trouble. And so you either want to know a lot about what Dr. Jung was teaching, or you want a good therapist with you, because once the unconscious gets a hold of you and takes a hold of you, well, what they say is when you go into depth, the first thing you run into is the devil. And I've certainly experienced that personally, and I've experienced a vision of Mephistopheles himself plopping down right next to me in my car. I've been working with my unconscious for quite a long time now, and there be monsters down there, and you better have control of it, and that means that you need a strong ego, and that means you need to have gone through the Job archetype as many times as possible. Okay, so there were, Jung then was talking about the historical theories of neurosis. Freud said it was all about eros. Adler said it was a will to power. Logically, the opposite of love is hate, and of eros is phobos, or fear. But psychologically, it is the will to power. So where love reigns, there is no will to power, and where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking. The one is but the shadow of the other, and I think that we can see that in our current administration, where there are many power mongers, but there's lacking love and very little empathy for example, the children on the border. But nonetheless, life is born only of the spark of opposites, ergo the United States and its incessant debates. One issue that Dr. Jung is talking about in paragraph 80 is the difference between introversion and extroversion, which is idealism and materialism. And so the extroverted materialist is the person that owns a 63-foot yacht, which I showed you the picture of. Remember, I showed you a photograph of a 63-foot power yacht, and the name of it was Never Enough. Well, a materialist is never going to have enough, but they're not going to have happiness also. And so you need to have a balance between your spiritual side and your introverted and your extroverted sides. And so the introvert thinks and considers before acting. And so in terms of election 2018, we have Mr. Mueller as the introvert, and the extrovert finds that unknown situations fascinate him. His action is swift, with no misgivings, no reflections on, I wonder what will happen if I throw my son under the bus, type thing. You know, he just doesn't think about that. And so that's the perfect extrovert. And the problem is that the two sides have never understood one another. Now, Dr. Jung was talking about a marriage between an extrovert and an introvert, but just consider it in the context of the face-off between the president and Mr. Mueller. I'm still in paragraph 80. Paragraph 80 is one of these interminable Jung paragraphs. It's about 2.5 pages long, but anyway, I'm going to quote from it. But when the man has made enough money, or if a fine legacy like the presidency should drop from the skies and external necessity no longer presses, then they have time to occupy themselves with one another. Hitherto they stood back to back and defended themselves against necessity, but now they turn face to face and look for understanding, only to discover that they have never understood one another. Each speaks a different language. Then the conflict between the two types begins. The struggle is envenomed, brutal, full of mutual depreciation, even when conducted quietly and in the greatest intimacy. For the value of the one is the negation of the value of the other. It might be reasonably supposed that each, conscious of his own value, would peaceably recognize the other's value, and that in this way any conflict would be superfluous. I've seen a good number of cases where this line of argument was adopted without, however, arriving at a satisfactory goal. So Dr. Jung wrote that 102 years ago, and obviously that was before our president was born and before Mr. Mueller was born, but he seems to me he predicted our situation pretty much. So paragraph 84, sensitiveness is a sure sign of the presence of inferiority. So the fact that we see the president being extremely sensitive right now means that he's feeling very inferior internally. Then he goes on, the essence of the inferior function is autonomy. It is independent, it attacks, it fascinates, and so spins us about that we are no longer masters of ourselves and can no longer rightly distinguish between ourselves and others. So, is that going on in the U.S.? I think so. Paragraph 94. It is unhappily the case that no man can direct the so-called disposable energy, libido, at will. It follows its own gradient. Indeed, it had already found its gradient even before we set the energy free from the unserviceable form to which it was linked. Then he refers to the primordial images, the most ancient and the most universal thought forms of humanity. They are as much feelings as thoughts. Indeed, they lead their own independent life, rather in the manner of part souls. And I think last week I gave the example of my vision of the dinosaur when I was about 6 years old. Obviously, that image was in my ancestors for many millions of years because I never knew of a dinosaur like that one, which I saw. Thomas says, our society is extroverted at heart, is it not? Absolutely. And Dr. Jung regularly commented on that. I've seen him comment on that many times about the American psyche. And Fred says, the thing is, I don't get motivated to do anything, relationships, business, success, hobbies, etc., since I am in a nihilistic, confused state of asking, WTF, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, am I doing here? I'm not a mental health professional, Fred, so I wouldn't presume to solve existential dilemma like that on a YouTube live stream, but you might want to check with a mental health professional, and I urge you to do that. And the other thing is just start reading Dr. Jung, which is what I did 31 years ago. And I found that he basically served as my psychotherapist, even though he died long before I needed him. But nonetheless, I've been able to use his books. And so I would urge you to consider doing that, because that you may find that helpful. Thomas says, Susan Cain's Quiet, the Power of Introverts in the World That Can't Be Stopped, That Can't Stop Talking, goes into this deeply. It's a great work. I bought it, and unfortunately I gave it to my mother-in-law. I never got to read it myself, but I definitely would like to. Fred, in my opinion, there's no such thing as introverts. Introverts usually are filled with insecurities, so they cannot blossom and express themselves in their highest form, extrovertedness, due to fear. Well, I don't concur with you, Fred, that extrovertedness is a higher form, being an introvert. I think that these things are relatively balanced. As you see, I'm managing to express myself in the form of 695 videos. So I'm a pretty introverted guy, but I managed to express myself pretty well. Thomas says, Cain talks about how introverts learn how to fake extroversion in order to survive in the Western world. Element of truth in that. And alien, that's not true. If you're an intelligent introvert, you don't have to be insecure to prefer small interaction. Well, no, you don't have to be insecure. And, my way of talking about this is an extrovert goes to a party and wants to yuck it up with a lot of friends, and an introvert wants to stand over in the corner with one or two people and talk. And so that's what I'm doing here. This is an introverted function here. But nonetheless, we managed to get our points across. I certainly have been able to do so through my career, even though I'm a pretty serious introvert, because in my youth I kept having to move between schools, and that required me to be introverted for a period of time in each new school. So I learned to be quiet until I understood my environment. Thomas, I'm fortunate in knowing why I'm here to write and to avoid small talk as much as possible. Very sensible. I loaned the Cain book out myself. And when you loan a book, it never comes back, boy, Fred. But introverts are extroverted in certain situations. They can be quite loud and exciting in situations where they feel safe and aloof in others. Sure. I mean, I have given public talks with 1,000 people in the room, so I managed to do it. Thomas, extrovert comes in the door, says, I'm here, while the introvert comes in the door, says, there you are. Okay, that's a good one. I like that. I may have to use that one. Fred says, we are social creatures. We are naturally extroverted until traumas and life experiences cause you to slowly crawl inside your shell. That's unless you have certain genetic predisposition like autism. Okay, I don't know about that. This is all from experience and personal opinion. I'm not claiming to be 100% correct. Yep, okay. And I'm not disputing what you say. I do acknowledge that when I was pulled up out of my elementary school classrooms many times and moved across the country and dropped down in another one where the class had already formed 2 months earlier, and so I was kind of a fifth wheel all the time until I could find my way into the group. That does tend to cause introversion. So carrying on here. Paragraph 94, it is unhappily the case that no man can direct the so-called disposable energy at will. It follows its own gradient. Indeed, it had already found its gradient even before we set the energy free from the unserviceable form to which it was linked. Paragraph 105. We have now found the object which the libido chooses when it is free from the personal infantile form of transference. It follows its own gradient down into the depths of the unconscious and there activates what has lain slumbering from the beginning. It has discovered the hidden treasure upon which mankind ever and anon has drawn, and from which it has raised up its gods and demons, and all those potent and mighty thoughts without which man ceases to be man. Paragraph 108. The question now arises, whence came this new idea that thrusts itself upon consciousness with such elemental force, and whence did it derive the power that could so seize upon consciousness that it completely eclipsed the multitudinous impressions of a first voyage to the tropics? The idea of energy and its conservation must be a primordial image that was dormant in the collective unconscious. Such a conclusion naturally obliges us to prove that a primordial image of this kind really did exist in the mental history of mankind and was operative through the ages. As a matter of fact, the proof can be produced without much difficulty. The most primitive religions in the most widely separated parts of the earth are founded upon this image. That's primitive energetics. This concept is equivalent to the idea of soul, spirit, God, health, bodily strength, fertility, magic, influence, power, prestige, medicine, as well as certain states of feeling which are characterized by the release of effects. This power concept is also the earliest form of a concept of God among primitives. That is why it lies ready to hand in the unconscious of every man. Paragraph 110. They exert a fascinating and possessive influence upon the conscious mind and can thus produce extensive alterations in the subject. One can see this in religious conversions, in cases of influence by suggestion, and particularly at the onset of certain forms of schizophrenia. The mistake he makes comes from attributing to a person the contents of the collective unconscious. In this way, he makes himself and his partner either God or devil. Here we see the characteristic effects of the archetype. It seizes hold of the psyche with a kind of primeval force and compels it to transgress the bounds of humanity. It causes exaggeration, a puffed-up attitude, inflation, loss of free will, delusion, and enthusiasm in good and evil alike. The idea of an all-powerful divine being is present everywhere, consciously if not unconsciously, or unconsciously if not consciously, because it is an archetype. No matter how beautiful and perfect man may believe his reason to be, he can always be certain that it is only one of the possible mental functions and covers only that one side of the phenomenal world which corresponds to it. But the irrational, that which is not agreeable to reason, rings it about on all sides, and the irrational is likewise a psychological function. In a word, it is the collective unconscious, whereas the rational is essentially tied to the conscious mind. Remember, in Enantiodromia, we need both the rational and the irrational. Paragraph 112, the only way out is to recognize that which you are not. Okay, so the point here is that you have to consider what you are, then recognize that which you are not, and realize that that is within you. Of course, that would never happen with our president, but paragraph 113, it is essential in differentiating the ego from the non-ego that a man should be firmly rooted in his ego function. That is, he must fulfill his duty to life so as to be in every respect a viable member of the community. All that he neglects in this respect falls into the unconscious and reinforces its position so that he is in danger of being swallowed up by it. But the penalties for this are heavy. As Sinuous opined of old, it is just the inspired soul that becomes God and demon, and as such suffers the divine punishment of being torn asunder like Zagreus. Paragraph 114. In the case of an older person, we must nurture everything that assists the descent.